Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Baig, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 79th episode. I'm very pleased to have with us Ms. Grace Fu, Singapore's Minister for Sustainability and the Environment. Prior to her current appointment, Ms. Fu was the Minister of Culture, Community and Youth. She has also held various positions at the Prime Minister's Office, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Ministry of National Development. Ms. Fu began her career with the Overseas Union Bank and was the Chief Executive Officer of PSA, Southeast Asia and Japan before joining the public sector. Minister Grace Fu, an honor to have you on Kopi Time.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'd like to begin with the here and now, energy security. Soaring energy prices all over the world,
this
including
is the topic in town, isn't it?
Absolutely. So give us a sense of, a place like Singapore, we don't have natural resources, but we have to deal with this global shock. How do we deal with this?
That's our karma, because being a very small country with no natural resources, we will have to deal with, the security of energy, of water, of food. We import most of, if not all of our energy sources with some renewable solar energy in Singapore. But other than that, we have been, in a way, managing this issue about energy security for a long time. And I think it's sent us a shock. The shock is not just for Singapore, but I think it's a very global shock. It has to do with a geopolitical situation, but unfortunately, because we have been so connected, the world has been. And so if you want to basically extract out an important supplier, I think that's where the dislocation is happening. In that one move of invading Ukraine, I think Russia basically has slapped a carbon tax on everyone because fossil oil and gas have actually just gone up. It also sharpened our attention really on this issue about energy security. And particularly, I think, in Europe, where they are getting gas, oil on pipelines. How do you deal with a secure supply, protecting the countries from political decisions? I think it's now top and center of minds of political leaders. And I think this will be helpful towards renewable. Because if you are to invest in your own energy sources, what would that be? Bearing in mind that there's going to be issue of decarbonisation over the next 30 years, there's a net zero commitment in the next 3 decades. What kind of energy sources would you invest in? And I think in the long run, I think it's going to do renewable a lot of good. Renewable, actually, it's the most secure, I think, from a country perspective, because for most countries, sun is available, free of charge. And it's also most democratic because whether you're a rich country or poor country, you get the same sources of sun. So I think it is a good opportunity for countries to really look at increasing the mix of their renewable. And indeed, I think that's what's going to happen. That's my prediction.
But we have sun, but we don't have land.
We don't have land. So we are one of the few, maybe city-states or small countries that actually do not have the land. And for us, there's always be a trade-off with land take. Because land is scarce, unlike some other countries, land is scarce, and therefore we will always have to put land as a constraint. So whether it is land for industry, industrial use, land for manufacturing, land for defense, land for housing, recreation, and now solar, it will always have to be measured against opportunity costs and so on. So we have to really work much harder to look at alternative sources of energy. As we move to more renewable, like all countries, you have to deal with the complexities that's going to come with it. Because you're going to have multiple sources, you're going to have intermittency from weather and climate. You are going to deal with probably many different sources because each of the solar is a power generation, and therefore how does the grid going to take in multiple sources that could feed and draw at the same time. So the grid has to go really smart, and we have to really look at how can we manage security at the same time, because there's still climatic conditions for renewables such as solar or wind. And we have to look at some stable source that can buffer us when the climatic conditions are not favorable. And that really complicates our energy decision. We would also like to look at other sources, such as importing renewable from the region, from a regional grid. Increasingly, we're very interested in hydrogen, because that's receiving a lot of attention from many countries. Huge amount of investments in R&D have gone into it. We have put some money into that. We've also started to participate in trials and so on in the transportation, the logistic chain of hydrogen. We hope that we will make some headway, and it's going to be expensive in the beginning, like most new technology, but with scale, we will iron out the costs of transportation, we'll iron out the cost of production, we will lower the cost of production, unit cost of production if we increase the scale, and hopefully we'll bring it down to a level where it's commercially affordable and competitive.
Do you foresee Singapore being sort of a price taker in terms of technological developments, or would you like Singapore to be an investor in developing frontier technology with respect to renewables?
Actually, both. Because we are investors, we are investing in R&D, and we have invested maybe in the last decade or so, but we're going to increase our investments in urban solutions and services. We have also put in some money on energy, including nuclear energy, for example. But as a small country with a small demand, we will never be able to drive the unit costs. So we need the unit costs of big market that can offer us. We piggyback so that we can benefit from a larger market and also lower unit costs with that. But we like to be at the frontier so that we can be early in the adoption, because we believe that this transition in energy is offering us an opportunity of a new growth area, and we like to participate fully in it.
You talked about the intermittency of renewable energy, and one bottleneck there is storage.
Yes.
Are you optimistic that technology is evolving fast enough that we can get a solution around storage?
I must say that I've not been intimately involved in the R&D of battery, but I understand that the investment that's going into this area is actually multiplying.
Correct.
And when there's money, there's resources in there, I think the human creativity will follow and will attract the best brains, and I think I'm hopeful in that sense.
Yes, I think we need some human ingenuities to solve this issue by all means. Minister, if I may talk about long-term strategy. So we've been reading about the Singapore Green Plan for 2030 and so on. If you could elaborate on that in addition to just the energy insecurity issue, what is the Green Plan and where do we go?
Actually, the Green Plan came about when we put a few things together. We have submitted our nationally determined contributions to UNFCCC about our carbon abatement and emission reduction plan. And we have been really thinking about this issue about decarbonizing for a long while. Maybe a few years back, the momentum wasn't felt, and we were not quite sure whether we had the technologies and the ability to do so. But I think the last few years, there's been tremendous pickup in the momentum. And we have seen how the financial sector, for example, is also coming on board. Plus the fact that we have reached very significant milestone at COP26 with carbon credits, for example. This has given us a lot of optimism and hope. And with the momentum, as I mentioned earlier, we think that this is also an area of growth for us. So with sort of a carbon abatement plan and also our own needs for sustainable development, we've put together the Singapore Green Plan. It is more than just climate action. It's also about how do we develop our economy, how do we develop our society on a sustainable manner. So issues such as how do we deal with waste treatment? How do we reduce our waste so that we will not run out of landfill sites? These are all constraints that we have to live with, and we want to come get all the ministries that are involved in this, or in some way that has a hand in producing carbon and has a policy lever on carbon emission, on sustainable development, to bring their plans together. The process itself is actually the most significant part of it, the process of coming together with that plan. Because there are trade-offs, even if you look at the plan. When we talked about long-term security on food supply, we are bringing in carbon emissions of food supply to Singapore, when if we just import, the carbon is incurred outside Singapore. So when we do that, there are actually new sources where carbon emission is expected. So these are all trade-offs that we need to make within the government, between the ministries, to agree that this is the common direction that we will take. Another example would be on mobility, electric vehicles. When we're going to move to EVs, we will need infrastructure. We're going to increase the demand on the grid. So from having petrol stations and terminals, we are now increasing our load on the grid and with charging stations. So that's where, between EMA, between LTA, between Ministry of Transport and Trade and Industry, we need to harmonize our plan. And the Green Plan actually has that purpose and serves that purpose. So when we speak, whether to the people, whether to the companies, or whether to external parties, we speak with one direction. And I'm reiterating this because very often we find this piece to be missing in other countries, because you will have different ministries sort of looking at their own sort of carbon emission, and that coordination sometimes is what the businesses are asking. Where do we find a coordinated plan? And I think Singapore has that. It's a coordinated direction. We don't have all the answers, we don't have all the targets. It's an evolving plan. As we have new technology that comes on board that looks viable, we will update it, we will increase the pace of change, and it will also guide us on our R&D pathways. So very interestingly, after the Green Plan 2030 was announced, you'll find organizations sort of taking the Green Plan and implementing that in its own organizational plan. Universities, for example, NUS has a 2030 plan. So in order for the country to be 2030, reaching certain targets, what would be the pathway of an organization like NUS? And they want to go ahead of this National Green Plan. So that has its purpose of mobilizing the resources and also the attention and the imagination of all stakeholders in Singapore, whether you are in academia, whether you're in research, whether you're a company, to look at how you can play a part and how you can take advantage of the opportunities that's going to come your way with Singapore Green Plan.
Right. When you talk about coordination among all the government bodies, how does it work operationally? And by that, I mean, do the annual budget processes, do they involve taking into account the Green Plan, or is there like an interdepartmental or interministerial task force that is looking at the Green Plan and updating it?
Yes, we do have an interministerial committee. It's called the National Climate Change Secretariat. This is chaired by SM Teo Chee Hian. Bring together all the relevant ministries. We sort out decisions that sort of stretches across ministry. In a way, that's where the hardest negotiations sometimes happen. But once we decide and once we negotiated on targets, on carbon tax trajectory, for example, it feeds into the budget process. So ministries that have those targets in mind and need resources to reach the targets will then go through the budget exercise with MOF. That's clarity, because MOF is involved and is aware about the decision taken at NCSS, and therefore I think it sort of reduces the need for further coordination, further discussion at MOF. So it's a clarity that has been helpful to enable ministries to work towards their targets.
I'd like to get into something that you touched earlier and something that is very close to us, our heart here at DBS, which is climate finance. You mentioned that climate finance will play an important role in the decarbonisation strategy and so on. You like what's happening in the Singapore financial sector on carbon trading and other progresses that's taking place?
I think this is an area that is really working at full speed. And the pace of change is actually very fast. Just give you an example on financial reporting, taxonomy. Some things that can take sometimes like a decade to get standardized, harmonized standards going on across the world is now taking probably in the span of months, if not a year or two. So the pace at which different regulators, different standard setters are coming together and agreeing on, working together towards a harmonized, standardized taxonomy, definition, and reporting requirements is actually at breakneck speed, I would say. There's also, I think, a lot of interest with the development of green bonds and green loans segment. You can see that there's new ETS now being launched, really trying to capture the interest of investors in the area of ESG investments. So whether it is at the regulator level with disclosure requirements, we are already looking at compulsory, compulsory disclosure at listed companies, starting with hard to abate sectors, working down to having a database of ESG data that MAS and CDP have come together and basically allowing investors much greater ease in extracting data that is, first of all, harmonized with same standards, and also allowing investors to then make better decisions and more discerning with which are the ones that is ahead on the ESG agenda. So these are all developments that I think are very important to develop a market that is credible, that is trusted, and that has high standard. We must get on a very strong and robust set footing, because we have seen how in the past, when poor standards or fragmented standards have allowed companies to pick and choose what they report. And as a result, I think in some ways, when one or two bad cases have actually diminished the credibility and the trust of investors. So we must get the basics right. And I think we are moving very quickly at a very good pace and at high standards. So that's an important part. And I am full trust that MAS will carry out their plans to develop this market in the ways that they have put in their Green Finance Action Plan.
I sometimes wonder whether we as economists or private sector finance practitioners have sort of failed the world, that without strong nudge from the public sector, we just couldn't make proper progress on emissions trading or carbon trading. So do you feel this shift in thinking that this is one area, it's too important to be left to the private sector, that you do need strong oversight?
I think you're not giving yourselves credit, because I think DBS played a very important role, for example, with coming up with Climate Impact Exchange. This is one of those AFAs, Alliance for Action,
right,
that came out of COVID. Something good has come out of COVID. We wanted a participation of private sector in looking at areas that we want to do during COVID period that allows Singapore to emerge stronger as part of the Emerging Stronger Task Force. And in the sustainability area, DBS, Olam, Temasek, some other companies decided to come together and look at this exchange for carbon credit in Southeast Asia. Well, not Southeast Asia, but having Southeast Asia as the focus at the start. And I think fast forward 12 months, it has made very good progress. And it's actually taking a lead in creating a market for carbon credits. with high standards. We'd like to think that that's one example of how it's a partnership between private and public sector. Private sector coming up with the ideas, with the creativity, with the resources to do business development, develop markets. At the same time, public sector coming in with the regulations, with the right nudges, with maybe a trajectory of carbon tax that's going to increase significantly, and therefore giving the right conditions to the market development. But actually, I mean, these are a good example of how we can use that to develop the carbon credits. But if you think about the impact that lenders, investors like yourself can actually impact the whole movements towards climate action and a low carbon future, you have great influence. The fact that you have come together, for example, under GFANZ, that you're going to put your assets and your lending capacity to work, you have actually committed to moving to net zero yourself. You can do a lot that the government may not be able to do because you have that touch point. You are able to influence many more of your lenders. Your multiplier effect is actually huge. So my wish is that every lender like DBS would go on to impact all your customers, all your suppliers, to really move towards sustainable development. I think that's really powerful. Yeah, and you are able to see, because you have access to balance sheets, projections, business plans, you have much better information than the government would. And I think your impact in going to the ground, in multiplying many, many more large companies, mid-sized companies, small companies that sometimes government will not be able to reach, is a lot more powerful than you think, or you're made out to be.
Right. I suppose the reason I sort of sound cynical sometimes, I hope that cynicism does not overtake me, is that you hear about companies virtue signaling or looking at ESG as a box checking exercise, and which is where I feel that, as you were saying, the taxonomy, the regulatory standards set by the government bodies have to create sort of strong nudges so that people just don't do it as a box check.
Actually, it involves regulators, it involves private sector players like yourself. Actually, more importantly, there's also the people that's supervising this, the investors, the activists. They are now paying a lot more attention on reporting, on disclosure. And I think it is really pertinent for companies to be mindful of the supervisory effect of the investor public. And you have seen cases where activists have taken, into the boardrooms to put management, to take them to task, put them on notice about what's to come, and really driving the change. So it's no longer sufficient just to do virtual signaling, to make commitments in words, because your words are going to be held to accountability by the investor public or by activists. They will become investors just to send a signal to you. And we have seen it in many, many boardrooms, whether it's in the US or whether it's in a boardroom. And most recently, management of banks have also been taken to task for, undermining this whole investment on sustainable development. And these are, I don't want to go into specifics, but I think we are not short of examples of how we are now very mindful about the actions of parties that have made commitment. It's no longer sufficient to just make commitment. We are looking at actions.
Minister, actually, that reminds me, I wanted to ask you one additional question on the energy side that I forgot to ask, but this brings me back to that because of the activist investor issue. So in the last few years, we saw in the US, also in Europe, and perhaps elsewhere as well, that because of activism, a lot of fossil fuel companies started selling off their or divesting their reserves or cut back on their investments. And some would argue that as a result, we are fragile now, that we have this energy supply crunch, and all of a sudden we don't have enough refining capacity, enough production capacity. So did we overreach? Did we make a mistake, globally speaking?
Well, I think that a big factor is really, as I said, the disruption of a supply, or really trying to, in a way, reduce the influence because of embargo and because of energy security consideration, the supply of a significant player. I mean, if you try to reduce the reliance or dependence on Russian oil and gas overnight, we are going to be short of capacity anyhow. I think it is important for us to look at transition carefully. I think this episode with Ukraine war has shown us how badly things could go if we don't manage the transition. And it's really a transition that we need to go on board. It's not just a decision to decide to switch overnight without a clear transition plan. That will not work. So we need to think about how to encourage companies to transit. So they may have to add on capacity in gas, for example, while they run down coal-fired power plants. If we are being too purist about it and say that gas is fossil and therefore it's no good, then I think we may have transitional problem. So how do we do this without encouraging just plain investments and increase in capacity in fossil, but really looking at it as a shift? I think that's really where a lot of discussion on plans of transition is needed. Something that, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the bankers, the lenders, the rating agencies will have a hand to play to hold companies, the large oil majors, to account for their transition plan.
Among the various sort of long-term questions we think about, one is something that Singapore has been sort of conveying to the world, that net zero by mid-century. How hard is that to achieve?
Extremely hard, extremely difficult, and full of uncertainties. Because we have an outsized carbon footprint because of our industrial makeup. We are number one petrochemicals, we have a large aviation, we have a large maritime sectors. Although the carbon footprint doesn't count towards Singapore's footprint, but we are producing the petrol, the chemical products to support these sectors. So although we have high carbon footprint per capita, but it's because we are producing for the rest of the world in many of our manufacturing sectors. Petrochemical is one, our advanced manufacturing, our chip, for example, sectors export to the rest of the world as well. But it's energy intensive, and the carbon footprint from these manufacturing activities are counted towards us. And we don't have renewable options, because of land scarcity. Solar is very limited. We're trying our very best to install solar panels on rooftops, on water bodies, and we're exploring new areas as well to put solar panels. But wind will be limited because, we just do not have the land, we don't have the space. And we'll do our very best to look at possibilities. So we are exploring geothermal, we are exploring nuclear, but these are many years out there, not something that we'll do in the next 5-10 years, but maybe 2-3 decades later. So what do we do in the meantime? So the transition pathways is unclear. We know that we need to get down, we need to do certain things that will reduce the demand. So for example, we will have to electrify our mobility, our transportation fleet of cars and buses and so on. But it is not going to be enough. We need to then look at how do we decarbonize our power electricity grid. That's another big question mark. So we're trying on all fronts, importing renewables, looking at how to decarbonize, looking at also hydrogen, for example. But these are all not quite ready commercially. So we are putting in R&D, we are investing in pilot sites, we are participating in many sort of trials that will put us into a good position, to adopt some of these newer technologies. But it's going to be a lot of hard work. But we think that ultimately we are confident enough to commit to a deadline because there is the possibility of carbon offset. Carbon credit offset has given us some buffer. Some time, maybe a few years, if we are not able to meet it, I think we at least have some way to mitigate those impact. And that's how we intend to manage this. Really drive down demand, reduce the carbon footprint as much as we can through more efficient equipment, more efficient power generation, greener buildings that takes less electricity, higher energy efficiency, and in the process, then look at how do we green and decarbonize our power generation sector, which is by far the largest. And even for our petrochemical and our manufacturing sectors, carbon tax will be a main lever to signal what's going to come, so that carbon emission now has a cost. It's no longer cost-free. And that hopefully will also encourage companies to start thinking about technology, processes, equipment that will reduce their carbon footprint. So if we are able to do that sectorally, countrywide, system-wide, and then at the system level, reduce the energy, have an energy mix to really be more greener, then I think we can move towards a net zero future.
It sounds challenging, but it also sounds so fascinating, right? I mean, what would you rather do? I mean, this is the challenge of our times. Minister, I was at a conference recently, and several SMEs, Singaporean SMEs, stated the concern that carbon transition, carbon taxes are fine for large companies. They have the wherewithal, the expertise to deal with these things. They're ill-equipped and they're petrified of things like border adjustment tax that EU might be doing, or other countries having higher carbon tax and also having some sort of an adjustment. And they seemed panicky. So what is your message to Singaporean SMEs on carbon taxes?
Well, I think first of all, they're absolutely right in the sense that cross-border adjustments for carbon tax is actually on the card, is being discussed. And I think some of the regions have seriousness about implementation. So it is a risk for us, a political risk on some of this decision that's taken outside Singapore, but definitely has an impact on Singapore export. So I think it's good that our SMEs are aware of what's coming and be prepared. And that's the reason why I think we have a carbon tax in Singapore, partly to cause a change in carbon emission, but also at the same time address some of these potential risks. Because carbon cross-border adjustments will be applied if the country does not have a carbon tax. And the fact that we have a carbon tax, I think neutralizes some of the risks for us. For the smaller companies, we do not apply carbon tax on them because carbon tax is only applicable for those that emit more than 25,000 tons. So we're talking about large manufacturing companies in the petrochemicals, in power generation, and also in some of these large manufacturing companies. But obviously, some effects may feed through utility, and that's why I think we also would like companies, small companies, to look at their energy offtake. How do they reduce their electricity consumption? Can they be more efficient? Can they use more energy efficient equipment? Can they improve their processes to reduce energy, for example, or even water? Any resource that require energy will have has a footprint issue. So if they can do that systematically, understanding where are all the consumptions, where are all the electricity that is being incurred, and then systematically work through their company to reduce energy intake. And I think that's the best way for companies to mitigate the impact of carbon tax, at the same time also to be more competitive when it comes to selling their products into these markets that require high standards on sustainable standards. Increasingly, that's going to be the case, not just because of requirements of regulators, but also companies themselves in Singapore. When they are committed to net zero, they will look at their supplier, their ecosystem, and look at how the suppliers can supply them with products that can help them meet their net zero targets. And so I would like the SMEs to think about this really as an offensive measure. How can I be that company to supply to the increasing demand of sustainable products or products that meet high sustainability? That will give them a competitive edge over those that do not.
So early on in the conversation, we talked about energy security. The other thing that commands headline these days is food security. Yeah. And there is this 30 by 30 plan for Singapore, and we've seen quite a few initiatives out there, both at the private sector and public sector level. Farms in Singapore, which was not ubiquitous, and now we're hearing more and more about it. On fish, same thing, that off the shores of Singapore, a lot of aquaculture going on. Are we going to see more developments and investment in this area in the near term?
Absolutely. Because we are actually in a very nascent stage. For a long time, we looked at Singapore. We have so little land. How can we devote the land to agriculture, which is intensive, right? Land intensive. But over the last decade or so, various episodes in the sort of geopolitical sphere has highlighted us the importance of being more self-secure when it comes to food. But also climate has a big part to play as well, because we are seeing, sort of contemporaneous droughts happening in the region. And so even with diversification, climatic impact on food supply is going to be a serious risk for us. And what do we do then, So besides diversification, we also look at local production. And local production is we're just beginning, and it's such an exciting area. First of all, it cuts across many different food types, and each food type has its own sort of farming technology. And along this whole production and supply chain, each process itself can be improved, can raise productivity, and can actually increase yield. So from the start of the type of seed that you use, can you invest in R&D that gives you climate resilient seed, high yielding seed that is resilient to diseases, for example? And what kind of products are we able to increase the nutritional value of the products of the rice that we are planting? Are we able to, for example, increase the yield per plant? Are we able to reduce the length of growth period? How do we adjust the light so that we give it optimal amount of energy and it can grow fastest with lowest energy requirements? For example, in the early phase of the growth of the plant, you need very little light, but you need actually solution with carbohydrates. So actually it's what you drip into the plant. And then as it grows bigger, actually you need more and more light. So actually you can adjust the amount of light almost to the type of plant, to the phase of growth, and even to different species of the plant. So there's a lot of technology in there. How do I accumulate enough data? How do I capture the plants at the size that is growing and optimize it with the amount of nutrition that I give, the amount of sunlight that I give? And what is the best time to harvest so that, the restaurants that need it will get it at the optimal freshness? So it's logistic arrangement, it's manufacturing process optimization, it's digitalization with AI to mine databases is so fascinating. And I think this is an area that maybe Singapore is most concerned with, because most other countries, farming is done on soil.
That's right.
Outdoor. But because of our land constraint, we have to look at more intensive farming. And urban, agri-tech, high-tech, high intensity, high productivity is what we need in order to overcome high cost of land, high cost of labor. So we do have some unique challenges, but because of these challenges, I think we're looking at very creative and unique solutions as well.
Speaking of unique solutions, so we have real meat, real milk, real eggs on one side, and now we're seeing increasing developments on impossible meat and impossible milk, etc.
Yes.
So where does Singapore go with this?
So actually there are two developments that's going on, what you said. One is really plant-based.
Yes.
Basically, as you go up the food chain, the carbon footprint increases. So at the top, probably we're talking about, red meat like beef. So cattle rearing, huge emission with their burps, with their manure. It's high GHG, right? And they need a lot of land as well. So how do we continue to produce sufficient meat to cater to the growing population, the growing appetite, and yet not clear land? Because that's also a very important consideration for us. How do we not lose biodiversity with that? And how do we really not remove carbon sink with clearings of virgin forests? So these are all considerations at the system level that is constraining us. So, and if you think about climatic changes that's going to come, variation in climates, as we have seen in this Ukraine war, when you have lower yield, lower production of your basic commodities like maize, corn, wheat, it knocks on to your animal farming, right? Higher feed prices, higher prices for fertilizer, and therefore either you increase the cost and therefore the cost of meat, cost of produce, or you have to reduce the amount that you use and therefore reduce your yield. And it has the same effect, which is inflationary pressure on food.
Right.
Yeah. So that really points us to look for ways where we can produce protein, we can produce carbohydrates at much lower carbon footprint and with better protection against climatic changes. And so cell-based meat, for example, plant-based meat is one way where we can actually substitute red meat with plant commodity, reducing the carbon footprint for that. At the same time, also, if you look at cell-based, it's really to try to reduce the amount of carbon that is produced in having red meat. You don't have problem with the kind of greenhouse gases that the cattle will produce, and you don't have to deal with a lot of waste that is produced in the production. You don't have to remove the skin, the feather, parts that you don't eat, the bones. You just focus on producing the protein that you want, and that's meat. So in that process, actually you reduce carbon footprint significantly. And we want to be there because this is the area that meets our need, because we want to have the capability to be able to produce our own protein with very, very little land. And actually, that kind of technology meets our constraint on land.
So is the future vegan?
No, it's a future where people are still able to get their food choices, but at much better environmental impact than now.
Minister, earlier you talked about the urban footprint, that buildings have to be made more attuned to climate change, emitting less carbon and so on. I spoke with Vivek Pathak, who heads sustainability at IFC, and he pointed out to me that in large cities in China, buildings account for 10-12% of their greenhouse emission, the air conditioning and so on. So walk us through a little bit about how do we make not just the new buildings in Singapore, but the old buildings and the HDB complexes and so on more climate friendly.
Right. So actually, you're right in the sense that for cities, actually built environment is a big part in the carbon equation because cities typically are very sort of intensive in terms of land use, and therefore we want to be close by, we work in large buildings. But that's why cities are also more efficient on the carbon footprint, on the carbon side, because you are able to get from one place to another, you have the concentration, you're able to produce in a much more smaller area than it is if it's dispersed into the villages. So cities offer challenges, but at the same time, solutions as well. So how do we green our building is something that I think in the MND, BCA family, they're really spending time to think about this issue. So for new builds, the government, for example, is requiring all our government agencies to build to the highest green standard, which is what we call super low emission standard. We also require any government agencies to retrofit to a high standard when they do major retrofitting. We're encouraging companies to improve the energy efficiency of the air conditioning by giving grants. So part of the carbon tax equation is not just to impose a explicit cost on the emitters, but at the same time, putting incentives to encourage some of these emitters to do the right thing, to invest in process improvement, to invest in new equipment in order to reduce their carbon tax bill. So when we do that, that's how we can cause a change. Tax the emission, but at the same time, if you are prepared to invest in new cooling system, we will put in grants to support that. So it's both a carrot and stick kind of approach to steer the ship towards a different direction. We are also exploring some new concepts, for example, like district cooling. District cooling is quite common in an area like this where you are sitting on, but it is not so in public housing estate. So we're doing that in a new estate now in Tengah. It's on district cooling basis, because once you remove the need to generate or to do air conditioning, to cool on a single unit basis into a more integrated basis with scale, you reduce the wastage, right? So we think that it's a lot more energy efficient if we are able to pull all the cooling needs into a larger chiller, for example. And we'll do that for the new estates. We're also piloting to convert brownfield projects. We've started with that in Tampines. The Tampines business area in the center is actually an existing town, already very established for probably 20 years or so, with many sort of processing arm of insurance companies residing there. We are going to implement, or we are implementing district cooling, reconfiguring the way that the buildings are cooling themselves in those areas. And we are also now thinking about piloting in a brownfield HDB estates, something to think about. So we are learning as we go, piloting with a smaller district, learning the lessons from it, clear all the regulatory sort of hurdles, lots of it, and also think about what will require for the stakeholders, building owners, to invest and to convert, because it is pointless to have a district cooling system when the buildings are not drawing from it and continue to use their own self-contained system. Then it defeats the whole investment in district cooling. So there's a lot to be learned about putting in a new model of cooling. So we are learning with pilot sites and then expanding to the rest of the country. So that's happening on many fronts.
Mr. Fu, what a wide-ranging and incredibly informative and insightful conversation. I think on behalf of my viewers and listeners, I cannot thank you enough for your time and insights.
Thank you very much. And I hope that your listeners, your colleagues will join us on the drive towards a sustainable future. It's an exciting journey. It will be bumpy, it will have challenges, but I think the fruits at the end of it, the picking, will be really ripe.
As I said, it's a call to action like no other. It's the call of our generation. So we're there with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thanks to our listeners too. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge from Splice Studios. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. All 79 episodes of Kopi Time are available on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify, as well as on YouTube. As for our research publications and webinars, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.